Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. The time is now 1 p.m. We will go back on the record. We had left off, I think, contemplating Miss Fang being recalled.
Yes, sir, that's correct. Northwestern would recall Cynthia Fang.
And this is for the limited purpose of the settlement agreement.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Welcome, Ms. Fang. I believe you were previously sworn.
Correct.
Your witness.
Thank you. Ms. Fang, do you have in front of you the document admitted as Exhibit Joint 1?
I do.
Can you identify that document?
Exhibit Joint 1 is stipulation and settlement agreement of Northwestern Energy, the Montana Consumer Council, the Montana Large Customer Group, and the federal executive agencies and Walmart Inc.
Great. What was your role in negotiating the agreement between the settling parties?
I represented Northwestern Energy as VP of Regulatory Affairs.
And do you believe the settlement is fair as a whole?
I do.
Can you explain why?
When I think about what would constitute a fair settlement agreement, I do believe that we had representatives that covered broadly the interests of our Montana customers. And so the resulting give and take that came out of those negotiations, I do believe resulted in a fair result for all of our Montana customers.
Before we get into the details of the settlement and the rate design work that you did, can you walk the commission through the process of moving from allocated revenues to rates to bill impacts?
Yes. So when you think about the process, there's actually a little bit of a description of what that process looks like in my direct testimony. But basically, you start with an overall revenue requirement, and then you go into how that total dollar amount would be allocated across the customer classes. And so when you look at the settlement includes what that allocation to the different customer classes would look like. And then one difference between how that allocation is done in the settlement, different than how Northwestern presented it in our direct and rebuttal, is that this settlement, the allocation percentages to the different customer groups are based on our base revenue requirement as well as property tax. So when you look back at what was presented in my direct and rebuttal testimony, all of those allocations were based just on base revenue requirements. And so when you think about that process, Northwestern has been utilizing management applications consulting, so a consultant group to support our cost of service allocation and rate design efforts. And so they have been before this commission many, many times, have supported Northwestern also many times in many rate cases. And so one of the concerns we had in sort of that change in how those dollars were allocated was the turnaround time and being able to translate that into the ultimate rates that would conform to the expectations of all the settling parties. And so with that, Northwestern actually did it in-house in setting up the rate design. And so we began first with the electric rate design. And so when you think about the timing of when the settlement was filed, that was on Monday the 3rd. And so in working with the rate design experts with the other settling parties, we were able to get the rate design completed and agreed upon, and then that was submitted Wednesday the 5th. Once that was completed, then we moved on to the development of the rates. And so this includes, as I mentioned, because the allocation percentages included property tax and base rates, the development of the rates for base rates and property tax then for natural gas happened next. And so that was completed, again, working with the rate design experts of the settling parties and getting agreement on the final rates. That occurred on Friday and was filed on Friday, up April 7th. Following the conclusion of the development of those rates, then we moved on to the bill impacts for the different customer groups. And so that there was a preliminary version that was done over the weekend that continued to be reviewed on Monday and Tuesday. And the final result after the review was completed was provided on Tuesday, that Tuesday afternoon, to the parties and the commission at that time.
Great. Let's look at Exhibit C to Joint Exhibit 1 or Exhibit Joint 1. Can you explain for the commission what Exhibit C is?
Exhibit C is the stipulated electric rates inclusive of property tax rates. So this exhibit shows the resulting rates associated with that would accompany the allocations that are presented in Exhibit Joint 1. And this provides the detail between the various rate the cost categories associated with each of the rates for each of the customer groups. And what you'll see is a comparison between current at the time of filing and then the settlement and the change that would result from the settlement compared to 8/1 effective rates. So those were the current at the time of filing.
So is it fair to say that the detail in Exhibit C and honestly Exhibit D are additional detail to what was provided in your testimony?
I would say that Exhibit C provides if you look at joint one that includes the final settled revenue requirement numbers for combining base revenue requirements and property taxes and the allocation to each of those classes. Exhibit C provides the additional detail as far as how that would translate into the rates that would be applied to, that would be charged to customers.
So I apologize. My question was not particularly artful. Let me try it again. Is the rate design detail included in Exhibit C work that you did as part of your direct or your rebuttal pre-filed testimony?
No.
Is it work in your experience is normally part of a settlement agreement? This detail of rate design?
I think to be able to get from an agreed upon allocation to be able to see what the actual implications will be for customer bills, it's necessary work.
Okay, let's turn to Exhibit D. Can you identify that exhibit for the commission and explain what it is?
Exhibit D is stipulated natural gas rates inclusive of property tax rate. So this is the companion piece to Exhibit C, but for our natural gas customers.
Okay, and just for the record, are you aware that the work papers that support Exhibit C and D were previously admitted to the record as MEIC 3?
That is my understanding.
So can you explain to the commission, just give a flavor of the work that has to be done to create the rate design reflected in Exhibit C and D?
To walk through the detail of the rates, if I can reference the work papers, it might be more helpful to provide guidance as we do that.
Yep, we just need to plumb up there just for the commission's information. MEIC 3, which are the work papers, do not print well. They're a pretty complicated workbook.
Ms. Fang is being handed a computer, it appears. Yes, we should. Okay, so what I think would be advisable and helpful for all the parties is I think we're going to try to pull this up on the big screen behind us here so that everybody can just follow along. Why don't we go off the record for 5 minutes?
So I can see what you guys are seeing. I'm sorry. Almost there.
All right, time's 1:13. We will go back on the record. Please continue.
Thank you. So I think, Ms. Fang, if you could please walk the commission through MEI C3, which are the work papers supporting Exhibit C and D. Well, we're going to do C first, electric first.
So beginning with electric rates settlement work papers, starting on the first tab, allocation electric. So when you look at the top left-hand corner of the worksheet, you'll see the agreed upon settlement allocations, which are inclusive of the base revenue requirement as well as property tax. So there you have the current at the time of filing total revenues and then the settlement total revenues. And the increases, the dollar increases to each of those customer groups and the percentage increase for each of those customer groups. And then what you'll see is below that. So when you think about each of those components, we have property tax, and then the base revenue requirement is broken down into base T&D, and then it's our base gen or fixed gen component. So you see that on lines 23 and 24. So that shows what the incremental increase is to each of those two components. So that next level of granularity between that base revenue requirements. So then what you'll see is that when looking at the property taxes, the increase that we're looking at for property taxes is 12.94 to be able to get to the resetting of the property tax base. And if you take that out, what that is then the difference being base revenue requirement. That means that to get to that overall increase of 14.98% that you see in cell H18, when you break that between property tax and base revenue requirement, what you see is the property tax increase of 12.94%, which is in H21, and then the base revenue requirement increase, which is in H22 of 15.5. Breaking that down into the T&D versus base gen increase shows up as a 30.84 increase to T&D, compared to a 1.2% increase in base gen in cell H24. So with that, then if we move over into columns J through O on lines 10 through 16, what you see is first taking out the property tax increase from the expected increase from the settlement. So making sure that what we're looking at is the recovery of 100% of our expected of the property tax base update. You'll see in column K how that increase would look like allocated to all the customer classes. However, if you go back to the allocations agreed to on the settling parties, what you see in H is that for the GS1 primary and the GS2 transmission, those overall increases are set at 0. And so with that difference in the incremental property tax base reset are then reallocated to the remaining customer classes in column L. And then what you see in column M is what the incremental base increase looks like for each of the customer classes. Again, maintaining the settlement agreed upon allocations to GS1 primary and GS2 transmission of a 0% increase.
So Ms. Fang, I just want to have you pause for a second. When you talk about the property tax, is it appropriate to pull that out of the calculation of what the commission is approving because it's a flow-through expense?
So this is to make sure that we're identifying those two revenue categories appropriately. So property tax is a flow through. So this is to ensure that within the settlement dollars that we are able to recover 100% of the property tax base reset, with the residual being assigned to the impact on base revenue requirements.
Okay. What would you like to walk the commission through next with the work papers, if anything?
So then following that, what you see is in column O, this is what the increase to base looks like for each of the customer groups. And then what you see in columns Q through U is for each of the customer groups that have, with the exception of GS1 primary and GS2 transmission, what you see is how those should be impacting the different rate components. So within the settlement discussions, there are included discussions about what changes would or would not apply to the monthly service fee. And so for residential, there's no change to the monthly service fee. So any increase to the TND base revenue requirements would flow through energy and or demand charges within each of those rate categories. So for residential, that means that the increase to the base rates only applies to the energy charges and will not apply to the monthly service fee. And so each of those boxes sort of shows how that logic translates then to each of those components with the adjustments to the monthly service fee. So for GS1 secondary, it's a similar logic where there's no increase to the monthly service fee. And then what you see for the other groups, you'll see changes to the monthly service fee that are applied in those instances.
So is it fair to say, Ms. Fang, that there are a lot of moving pieces to allocate the rates and do the rate design for each of these classes of customers?
We did want to make sure that as we were developing the rates that we had captured all of the logic associated with the rate design that was consistent with what all of the parties were interested in as we were looking at the different customer groups. So making sure that residential, they got their assigned allocation as well as no monthly service fee increase, and similarly for each of the customers.
Can you speak about the importance of holding the monthly service fees flat, not increasing them? Because I saw several of the classes, including residential and irrigation, for example, have flat monthly service fees.
So this was part of the settlement discussion. So when you think about Northwestern's initial proposal, Northwestern did not increase for electric the monthly service fee for residential or GS1 non-demand. And as part of settlement negotiations, there were additional accommodations. This is the process of give and take between the parties in reaching a settlement, that irrigation also would not see an increase to their monthly.
And in your opinion, are the rates that were developed based on this analysis reasonable?
Yes.
Can you explain how, actually, before I go there, is there anything else related to the work papers you want to walk the commission through?
Yes, if we can go to the next tab, rate design. If you can scroll up to the top. So what you'll see is for each of these, if you don't mind going to the right a little bit. What you'll see is the logic behind how each of these were developed at each of the rate component levels. If you don't mind scrolling down a little bit. Keep going. And you'll see, once you go into the workbook, you should see all the formulas that go into the development of the rates. And if you scroll down just a little bit more, what you'll see is the target percentages for each of those, and then the checks to see whether or not that occurred. And there were a few additional, there was one other additional requirement across the settling parties that the rate design sought to resolve. So when you think about the difference in rates, there's choice and non-choice customers. And so for non-choice customers, they're paying our T&D as well as our generation energy supply rates. For choice customers, they're only paying our T&D, they're not paying our generation. And so one of the issues that parties agreed upon was the trying to bring as close together as you could the percentage impact that both choice and non-choice customers within each of these customer groups would see. If you don't mind going back to the first tab again, real quick. And so earlier when I was talking about the breakout of the increase between base T&D and base gen revenue requirements, there was a big difference in the increase associated with T&D compared to gen. And so to be able to normalize the impact between choice and non-choice customers, there were a couple of rate design accommodations that we incorporated for residential customers, as well as GS2 substation customers that I do want to call out. If we can go back to the rate design tab. So if you can scroll to the left, sorry. What you'll see is in the grayed out section on residential, that was the first attempt at doing that, doing the rate design where we noticed the difference between the choice and non-choice customer impacts. And so if you look at, you'll see in residential that there's a generation adder that's incorporated in the work papers. And what you'll see is that is actually shifting dollars from between choice and non-choice customers to start to equalize the impact between those two types of customers within that one customer group. And then if you scroll down to GS2 substation, it's going to be a little bit. There we go. What you'll see is the introduction of a generation demand rates, and that's intended to do the same thing for choice and non-choice customers within this group. And here it's structured as a generation demand rate because T&D costs are recovered through a demand charge within this rate group. And so when we move those dollars over into the generation bucket, we kept the structure of that cost recovery to try to keep the impacts consistent. And then there's two additional tabs after the rate design, the revenue summary tab, which is I believe exhibits Exhibit A from the settlement agreement, and then the last tab, Exhibit C, is Exhibit C, which was the output of this the work papers.
Okay, so the last two tabs of this exhibit also coexist in other places in the record. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. Is that, I don't even know how to ask this question. Is that sufficient for the electric work papers? Are you ready to move on to the natural gas?
I think that provides a high level overview of the structure of the electric work papers, but I'm happy to answer questions about details and the logic.
When we get there, I'm sure there will be questions. Let's move on to the natural gas portion of MEIC 3. So before you walk through the detail, Ms. Fang, can you just give a general overview of how the rate design development differed between electric and natural gas?
So with the natural gas, the logic of this follows to a large degree. It's consistent with how the electric rates work papers are set up, with one difference. So in looking at the various statements on the natural gas side, while the statements totaled out the same at the aggregate level, at the total level, there were some differences within certain line items. And because of that, the total revenues required some adjustment to be able to get to, which tied to one of the statements, had to have additional adjustments to be able to make sure that we had to adjust off of current rates to be able to get to the stipulated revenue requirements. And so what you'll see is in columns K, there's an additional adjustment to, you'll see property taxes. And so you'll see across this a couple of additional adjustments that you see to be able to reconcile the current numbers to get to the stipulated numbers.
Is the natural gas rate design more fluid since the rates are updated on a monthly basis through the tracker?
The supply costs that are updated through the tracker are not incorporated in this portion in the rate case. So they are captured. The impact is captured in the bill impact analysis.
Okay, great. So I think we are in the first tab. Can you walk the commission through that first tab, please?
Yeah. So the logic in actually all of these tabs is very consistent with how it's handled in the electric rates model. So at the top left, you see the table that's in the settlement agreement about the agreed upon allocation, which includes base revenue requirement and property taxes. What you see directly below that is the breakout between of each of those high level revenue numbers between property tax, base revenue requirements, as well as the individual components within that. So base TD and S versus base production. And then back up towards the right, what you'll see is the similar lineup of the breakout with the additional adjustment columns, as I mentioned earlier, captured in the development of that. And then further towards the right, beginning on column U, you see the detailed breakout of each of the customer classes for adjustments or exclusions of adjustments on the monthly service fee. And then the detailed calculations are presented in the rate design final tab. The final tab includes the additional adjustments compared to what we saw in the preliminary. That was where we identified the need to do further adjustments. And then the revenue summary tab is Exhibit B from the settlement agreement, and then Exhibit D is the final natural gas rates.
Okay. Okay, so that's all of the tabs in this portion of the exhibit, correct? I'm sorry, you have to verbalize your answer.
Yes.
You share actually strike that, sorry. Were all of the settling party expert witnesses who offered testimony on rate design and were part of the conversation about cost allocation, did they review and approve the work papers and the resulting exhibits?
Yes, all of this work was done in collaboration with the rate design experts of the settling parties.
Great, thank you. Is there anything else on either the work papers or exhibit C or D that you would like to offer to the commission in support of settlement?
I can't think of any.
Okay, super. So let's shift gears a little bit. I still want to talk big picture. Can you explain from Northwestern's perspective how affordability was considered as the settlement was negotiated?
The affordability of this rate case to our customers is an important consideration for Northwestern. When you look at the request we put before the commission, Northwestern was very thoughtful about what we've included in this. And with that, the rate case structure is based on a historic test year with known and measurables. So these are costs associated with 2021 and 2022. So these are all costs that Northwestern has already incurred to be able to continue to serve its customers safely and reliably. Since our last rate cases, both our natural gas and our electric rate cases, Northwestern has invested over $1 billion in continuing that service. And when you think about how things look across the industry, last we checked, over 100 utilities are in before their commissions with rate cases. And so in looking at concerns about affordability, you can see in our direct testimony where we actually put in quite aggressive moderation proposals in looking at the impacts across the various customer groups. In looking at how the settlement results continue to support what we believe to be affordable results for our customers, this is, in looking at the results, you'll see that the total dollar amount allocated to residential customer classes is lower than what was in our direct as well as our rebuttal. So when you think about those percentages, you can't just look at the allocated percentage. You need to also consider the total revenue number, and that's how it translates into the customer bills. So when Northwestern saw that this was still going to be lower than what we had in our testimonies, we do think that we are considering affordability. And it is challenging to make sure that our customers, especially our residential customers of greatest need, are cared for. And so when even looking at the Northwestern website, when you think about the initial webinar we had, it was an important piece that we made sure that our customers were aware of the variety of assistance programs we have available for them. So both on our website, both as part of that webinar, we have a low income discount. We have LIHEAP, which I cannot remember the acronym. If you give me just a minute. Our low income energy assistance programs. We also have available payment arrangements. If they will call us, we are happy to work out payment arrangement plans, energy efficiency programs, weatherization, home energy checks. So we have a lot of programs that are available to customers that need that assistance.
Thank you. One issue that has been kind of floating around is the rate that Walmart gets charged. And I think Dr. Dismukes touched on it also, but are you aware if Walmart gets a special rate?
Walmart is one of many customers in our GS1 secondary rate schedules. And I believe there was the question about, are they on a different rate compared to other grocery stores, at smaller grocery stores? And they're all on the same rate schedule. And so there isn't distinct pricing that is available to each of those customers within that group. And one thing I do want to note, if you give me just a minute to find the reference. When you look at, this is in reference to LCG Exhibit 5, they had a presentation of how the settlement allocations compared to the different cost of service allocations, both presented by Northwestern and LCG. And that customer group already is one that's going to be the resulting allocation impact is going to be higher than the cost of service under both Northwestern's and large customer groups allocation. So they are one that's already helping to carry the weight of some of the residential subsidies that will continue to persist, even resulting from the settlements if approved.
Would singling out as a individual ratepayer, whatever size of commercial customer they were, for a rate hike be consistent with fair rate making principles?
I would have some concerns about whether or not it would constitute discriminatory pricing.
Okay. So let's transition to bill impacts. Can you explain the process that you use to develop bill impacts? Big picture first.
So once the rates are completed, then we move into the development of bill impacts. And so what Northwestern provided in Northwestern, I believe it's 48 and 49, compares the bills based on rates customers are paying today with what would be the result of the settlement if it were to be approved by the commission. And so in doing that, we had to basically update the rates on both sides, as well as incorporate some of the new elements that were developed as a result of some of the settlement provisions. And so as much as I wish it was a simpler and quicker process, it wasn't. And so while we had preliminary runs over the weekends, those had to be reviewed, and there were some corrections from that preliminary run that needed to be made to make sure that we were looking at apples and apples and had a clear understanding of what the differences were when we were looking at the comparisons compared to what we had previously filed with our direct testimony.
So I think Northwestern 48 and Northwestern 49 have been marked for the record, but have not yet been admitted. We renew our motion to admit those to the record.
You're correct. Those were marked. They have not been admitted into the record. Mr. Nell? Is there, I'm just going to do a mass request. Is there an objection to entering 48 and 49 into the record? Seeing none, they are admitted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you provided an overview, Ms. Fang, about how the bill impacts were developed. Do you want to provide any additional detail or go into a little more of the granularity of how these were developed? I'm sorry, for the record, I'm looking at Northwestern 48, the electric bill impacts.
Not as far as specifics related to 48 and 49, though some additional context, I think, in looking at exhibits 50 and 51 would to talk through the differences between the rates that were current in effect at the time of filing direct versus
Okay,
current rates
before we
today.
get to those though, I do have a couple questions about 48 and 49. So let's
Okay.
finish 48 and 49. If you look at the first sheet in 48, this is Northwestern 48, can you explain to the commission the difference between line 25 total energy charge and line 27, the total bill?
Line 25, the total energy charge, is the summation of the bill components that are from line 16 through 24. So these are specifically the charges associated with the energy a customer uses.
Okay, so really the only thing being added to it is the monthly charge.
Correct.
What should the commission take away from the table? I'm still just looking at the first sheet, although this table runs through the entire exhibit. The table that starts on line 32, what should the commission take away from that table?
So when you look at the information provided in lines 10 through 30, this is associated with what we consider our typical residential customer. So when we look at our residential customers, the typical usage of that group is 750 kilowatt hours per month. And so this reflects the detail associated with that typical customer at that usage level. What you see in lines 32 and below are bill impacts associated with different levels of usage. So you can look at if a customer is a 500 kilowatt hour customer, what that impact would look like, or if they are a 5,000 kilowatt hour customer, what that bill would look like. And so you see that the range of bill impacts going from a 500 kilowatt hour a month to a 96,000 kilowatt hour a month customer, we're looking at bill impacts that range from 7.48% to 7.92%.
Okay, thank you. If we look at the first page, which is the residential electric utility service bill impact, it looks like the difference between the rates being paid today, which include the interim increase, to the settlement increase is about an 8% in overall increase in cost. Is that true?
Correct.
And in your opinion, is that a reasonable increase?
I think when looking at this, and especially when we consider the what's fully reflected in this, I do believe it is a reasonable increase.
Good. I'm sorry that this exhibit doesn't have page numbers, but I'm looking at GS1 primary non-demand. I believe it's the fourth sheet in. Are you there?
Yes.
So if we look at this, if I'm reading this correctly, there's actually the bill impact is negative. Is that correct?
Correct.
Can you explain how that happens for some of the classes?
So this would be specific to GS1 primary, and the expectation is we would see the same for GS2 transmission. So if you go back to table 1 in the settlement agreement, you'll see that the agreed upon allocations include a 0% increase to those two customer groups. And this is going back to the cost of service study discussions that you've heard from other witnesses, that those two groups saw a negative, or I think it was a 1%, depending on the different cost studies you were looking at. For those two groups, parties agreed upon a 0% increase. And so because these customer groups saw an increase as a result of interim, this decrease would be to bring them back to the current effective rates and bills at the time our direct was filed.
Okay, thank you. Do you believe that the rate assignments across all classes and reflected in both Northwestern 48 and Northwestern 49 are fair and in the public interest?
I believe they are. When you look at the recovery of costs incurred from the utility and the allocation to the customer groups and the cost studies, if you take all of that into consideration, I do believe the settling parties came to a good balance of the different interests and the different customer groups.
Okay, great. Is there anything else on 48 and 49 that we should cover with the commission?
I don't believe so.
Okay, super. Let's turn to Northwestern 50 and 51. Okay, let's start with Northwestern 50, which I believe is related to electric. Can you explain, and these documents have been admitted to the record. Can you just explain what this document is?
So in this document, this includes the typical customer for each of these customer groups from exhibits Northwestern 48 and 49, and adds to that the current rates at the time of filing. So the August 1, 2022 effective rates that were presented in exhibit ADD 13.
Okay, super. And I apologize because I think we did cover some of this yesterday. Is there anything in Northwestern 51, which is a reflection of natural gas rates that you'd like to walk through for the commission?
Oh, before, if I can add one more point. So for Northwestern 51, it also includes the addition of the August 2022 rates. And I just want to note that the key differences between the August 2022 and the current effective rate, the current rates in effect today would be the implementation of interim rates on October 1st and the property tax rates effective January 1 of 2023. On the electric side, there also includes differences associated with PCAM rates for and as well as deferred balances. And in addition, on the gas side, there's also changes in the gas supply rates and also the expiration of the TCGA credits.
Okay, so just so we're completely clear, the bill impact analysis that Northwestern conducted in its direct and rebuttal case was rate base related only, correct? The bill impacts that we did.
At that time, they would have reflected both the base rates as well as the expected impact from property tax and the PCAM base update. But many of the changes between August 22 and March 23, with the exception of the property tax and interim, those are additional differences between those August 2022 and the current effective rates.
So when you look at Northwestern 50 and you look at the rate impact that changed from August 2022 to settlement, that 28%, it's not an apples to apples comparison to the 25% that Northwestern was initially requesting, is it?
Correct. That's correct. There are differences. And so those are the changes that I described that are outside of the scope of the rate case.
So if the commission chooses to accept the settlement, the rates that Northwestern has agreed to with the other settling parties will result in lower bill impacts than the original case in chief that Northwestern presented. Is that correct?
Could you repeat that question?
Well, we'll see if I can. If the commission accepts the settlement with the rates agreed upon and the bill impacts that flow from them, that those rates are lower than the rates initially proposed by Northwestern. The settlement includes concessions with a lower rate revenue that would flow to the rate design and flow through bill impact. Is that correct?
So if the bill impacts associated with the implementation of the settlement, regardless of the reference point, would be lower than Northwestern's request and direct testimony because of the significant reductions in the revenue requirement.
Is there anything else related to bill impact that you would like to discuss with the commission?
No. But I will. Happy to.
Let's touch on Sleepy Hollow. Northwestern's cost recovery for Sleepy Hollow assets were a topic of conversation over the last couple of days. Were you in the room or watching from the overflow room during those conversations?
I was.
Can you refer to paragraph 7 in the settlement agreement? Are you there?
Yes.
Chairman Brown asked where in Mr. Brzezina's testimony the rate-based data can be found. Can you clarify for the commission where that data can be found?
The discussion of Northwestern's recovery proposal related to Sleepy Hollow began in the direct testimony of Jeff Berzina. Between the direct and rebuttal, additional information was, we had actual information related to the costs associated with Sleepy Hollow. And there's actually a data request response that maps out all of those details. And I believe it was MCC 377?
337.
337.
Do you have MCC 337 in front of you by chance?
Yes, I do.
Can you just highlight what the total rate base number was in that? I think it's in subpart A. There was a lot of confusion flipping through Ms. Rich's exhibit.
If I can read, the response states, total plant added in 2022 for Sleepy Hollow purchase was $211,398.86. Because our rate base is being calculated on a simple average, this would result in an increase to rate base of $105,699.43, or 1/2 of the total plant additions. And then it continues to discuss a detail of the breakout of those plant additions by account numbers.
And is it your understanding that approximately $105,000 is what the settling parties agreed to add to Northwestern's natural gas rate base?
Yes.
Okay, that's all I have on that one. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about our favorite paragraph 15 of the settlement agreement and Yellowstone. I just have a couple questions for you about it. I think we're maybe on the same page now, but I just want to be crystal clear. Would you provide the commission your understanding of the prudency review in your role as Vice President of Regulatory Affairs that is noted in paragraph 15?
The prudence review expected to come as a result of the settling parties agreement is not expected to be any different than prudence reviews that have occurred before the commission prior to this. So, when you think about the examination of prudence of investments the utility has made prior to the filing of a rate case that show up in the rate case, we are expecting the similar level of rigor and review.
Would it be fair for the commission to expect Northwestern to put a substantially similar case forward that it would in a pre-approval docket?
I would expect that the content and the thresholds would be similar to what had previously been provided under pre-approval when that was available to Northwestern.
Is it your expectation that interveners will have an opportunity to examine, comment, and test the RFP process?
Yes.
Would the prudency filing include a discussion of Northwestern's capacity portfolio and capacity needs?
Yes.
The commission asked Mr. Higgins, I'm sorry, let me take it a little bit different. The commission asked Mr. Higgins why the settlement allows a temporary inclusion of O&M in the PCAM. Can you address President Brown's question about why it's important for us to include O&M on a short-term basis between that PCAM base update and the next general rate review?
Well, I think it's important to note that the settlement provision, paragraph 15, none of that would occur until the plant is in service. So that would mean that customers are receiving the benefits associated with the value that plant is bringing to serve customers. And when thinking about the operations expenses associated with operating a plant, this is one of those challenges that Northwestern faces as far as the ability to recover costs that it is incurring to serve its customers. And so that's the reason that it was the impetus for the reliability rider that we are no longer moving forward with, given the agreement of the settling parties on this mechanism.
Okay, so is it fair to characterize that answer that balancing the O&M cost to run the plant with the benefit customers provide is something important to put in front of the commission?
We do believe it is something important to put in front of the commission, and any of those expenses recovered too would still be expected, would be on an interim basis prior to prudency determination. So in the event the commission determined it was not prudent, then those would be refunded to customers with interest.
Great. That's all I have for our live direct. At this time, I would tender Ms. Fang for cross-examination.
All right. We'll go in the usual order. Ms. Trinnell. Yes, of course.
Am I on? Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Cindy. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. I'm going to use this little board we have here because I think it would be helpful for me, at least, and maybe other people, to just have a framing. You talked a lot in your testimony just now about the starting point and the ending point with the stipulation. So I'd like to just put that in very simple context here, if I may. And I'm going to work off of the staff memo, page 19, which has the numbers of your starting point, the Consumer Council's recommendation, and the large customer group recommendation for the settlement that I think you just walked through, and where we ended with the 81 that's before the commission now for approval.
Can we take just a minute, Mr. Chairman, so we can actually get a copy of what the witness is looking at?
This is this is the staff memo, page 19, but the numbers come from your initial application, your rebuttal testimony, the large customer group proposed recommendation, and the Consumer Council proposed revenue requirements.
Just
Hold on one second, Ms. Trinnell, please.
Sure. Yeah, I called it a memo. Is it a fact sheet?
okay, we have it. Thank you.
Yes, please proceed.
Thank you. So Cindy, I think the initial application was at, it was 102 million. And what were the rest of those numbers?
MCC 66 point
Your initial, Northwestern's initial request.
102 893 198.
198. Okay. And what was the large customer group's revenue requirement recommendation in their testimony?
46 594 239.
And the Consumer Council's recommended revenue requirements from their testimony?
66 703 068.
And then in your Northwestern's rebuttal request went up to about 105, right?
105 127 443.
Okay. And the settlement number that we're at? And I'll take that back. I'm finished with it. Thank you, which is, it's on in the stipulation. I think if you go to page 4 of the stipulation, table 1.
So my understanding of those tables, I believe those were base revenue requirements only.
So if you look at page 4 of the stipulation that's right in front of you there, and table 1.
So table 1 includes base revenue requirements plus property taxes. So I don't
And-
think they're
Okay, so
the
it's
same
Let her
comparison.
finish her answer, please, Mr. Mill.
okay. Let me just ask the questions incrementally then. What is the number in table 1 of the stipulation? The
So
81 million. And then we can go through the component parts of it. I'm just asking you right now for the number that we've reached there, that the compromise settlement before the commission. It's 81.9. Can you give me that
So
number?
What I'm explaining is that I do not believe that the number in table 1 is the right comparison point
Okay.
to the numbers provided in that table.
Thank you, Cindy. And Mr. President, my question is, what is the number? And then we can go through and your council will have an opportunity to ask you more questions. My question is, it's 81.9 is the settlement number right now. Can you just tell me what the rest of those numbers are that are before the commission right now? And Mr. President, can you just direct the witness to answer that question?
Well, Ms. Trinnell, I must confess, I'm a little confused
Okay.
at this point. I think Ms. Fang has answered that she's not sure that using apples to apples comparison. So
So, Mr. Chairman, maybe what would be helpful is if we noted what the numbers that are existing up there, what components they include, so that there's an apples to apples comparison that is actually useful to the commission.
Mr. President, I understand that Northwestern may have another line of questions following up on mine. If I may conduct my cross, I'll just go ahead and say, I can finish this up really quickly right now.
yeah,
Okay.
I'm certainly not interfering with your
Thank you.
ability to cross. I mean,
Thank you.
go ahead.
And then how we understand it and use it will be another question. So, okay. So, Ms. Fang, so the total electric revenues that are identified in table 1, set out here in this column is 81,906,631, correct? Is that the number that's set out here in table 4? Yes or no?
I do not believe the number in table 1 is the correct comparison point to the other numbers that are on that piece of paper.
Okay.
I think the correct number should be 67,377,467, if I'm understanding the numbers from the staff paper correctly.
Okay. So let's walk through that just piece by piece if we can. All right. So is it your testimony that this 102 in your initial application contains property taxes?
It does not contain.
It does
property
not.
tax.
Okay. Do you know what it would be with property taxes? Roughly.
I don't have that before me.
Okay. And is it your position that the 66 contains property taxes?
That is my understanding that it does not contain property taxes.
Okay. So this 66 right here and this 102, is that an apples to apples comparison?
That is my understanding.
Okay. And is this 46 contain property taxes?
I do not believe it does.
Okay. So would that be an apples to apples comparison with the 102?
That is my understanding.
Okay. So we have the large customer group coming in with a recommendation of 46 million for a revenue requirement. Yes.
Yes.
And we have the Consumer Council advocating for a 66.7 revenue requirement.
Yes.
Okay. And Northwestern is at initially 102 and then went up to 105.
Correct.
Okay. And what's before the commission right now, and we need to figure out what the component parts of this 81.9 are so that we're comparing apples to apples and everybody's on the same page. But this 81.9 is the electric revenue increase, at least as we have it in the table. And I understand you're saying there may be some other pieces to that.
So if you look at Exhibit A of the settlement agreement, you can see that the 81,906,631 is built off of a base increase of 67377,467. So that would be the comparable number.
Okay, point me to that number again.
So if you look at Exhibit A, stipulated electric revenue requirements. And there's two boxed lines. There's the rebuttal revenue requirement increase, and then the one below that is the stipulated revenue increase.
Right.
And so on the far right, where it says total excluding PCAM, that's the 81,906,631.
Right.
And then if you go in to there's the fixed excluding property tax, that total, you'll see the 67377,467, which
Okay.
would be comparable to our 102 from direct.
Okay, so you're backing out the property taxes. And right here, that would be 67.
67,377,467.
377, 467. So that, sorry, forgot the 7 there. So to put a box around that number, that is the apples to apples comparison of the initial request, the consumer counsel's position, and the large customer's position. Is that right?
That's what I believe is what's captured in those numbers.
Okay. So would you agree with me based on these numbers that the settlement before the commission is higher than either party's advocacy who were at the table for the settlement?
It's higher than the LCG and about $500,000 higher than MCC and materially lower than Northwestern's.
Okay, and thinking
So-
through,
When looking at these numbers, it appears to reflect compromised positions from all parties.
thank you, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to mark this as 350 Montana Exhibit 26 and move for its admission.
Is there objection?
Well, I'm not quite sure it's evidence and why, I'm not sure why we're marking it or putting it in, but.
Is that an,
I know.
is that a
I know,
puzzlement or is it an
Yeah,
objection?
exactly. It's more just an expression of befuddlement, but no, I will not object.
Right. Is there, Mr. Nell, did you say this was 26? Okay, is there objection to 350 Exhibit 26? Mr. Nelson.
I don't have an objection to the information. I have a concern about the format of this exhibit in that it produces a series of 8, 7 numbers with no label. Now, perhaps if the commission is comfortable that the written transcript is sufficient to follow along with what this means, then I'll certainly accept that. But I just want to note that from at least the LCG's perspective, it would be preferred if a version of this could be produced and admitted, subsequently in this hearing that included appropriate labels so that then any subsequent reviewing process would not get overly confused by what's being admitted.
I'm happy to create work papers for Mr. Nelson and circulate a complete exhibit, Mr. President.
Does anybody object to that solution, if you will?
We do not object to that.
Okay, so what I will do then is to admit 350 Exhibit 26, but on the condition that Ms. Trinnell try to recreate this document in a manner that is better labeled.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. What I'll do is circulate it to Mr. Nelson, and once we agree on the sites, which is I think what he's asking for, we can get it to you. I think we can work this out.
Okay, that's where we're at.
Thanks,
All right,
Mr.
Ms. Trinnell, do you have any more questions?
I do.
Okay, please proceed. then.
Thank you. Cindy, so you agreed to this settlement that the commission has in front of it to determine whether it's just and reasonable. One of the possible outcomes here is that the commission rejects the settlement. Isn't that right?
Correct.
Okay. And one of the possible routes forward here would be that the commission would take evidence, and a possible outcome is that the commission would find persuasive the large customer's testimony that a reasonable increase in this case would be $46.5 million. That's one possible outcome, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly
It's a yes
poss-
or no question, Mr. President, if she could be directed to answer that. Is that a possible outcome?
Mr. Chairman, I will object to the form of the question as argument.
I'm going to overrule that. You can answer
Yeah.
the question.
wait,
You can answer it, but you can ask if you need the question.
could you repeat the question?
Certainly. Cindy, is one of the possible outcomes in this case that the commission could hear the testimony of all the parties that have participated, find the large customer group's advocacy persuasive, and decide that the appropriate increase here would be $46.5 million. That's one possible outcome, isn't it?
Yes,
Thank you.
I'd like to add,
Your attorney will have an opportunity to redirect. So I would like to move on to my next questions, if I may, Mr. President.
You may.
Thank you. Cindy, Northwestern issued a press release on April 3rd, the same day that you sent the settlement agreement to the other intervening parties who weren't a party to the settlement, didn't it?
I believe that's correct. I don't have the specific dates or
Thank
the
you.
press release in front of me.
And Northwestern filed the settlement with the Securities and Exchange Commission the same day that it sent it to the intervening parties who weren't a party to the stipulation, didn't it?
I believe that's correct. I
Thank you.
don't handle those filings.
I'd like you to look at paragraph 15, if you would, of the settlement. And I'm going to ask you about ADD 17 in conjunction with my questions on this paragraph. If you don't have that in front of you, could you get it?
We'll
please?
get it. Just one
Thank
moment,
you.
please.
And let me know when you have the ADD 17.
I have it.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks. So in paragraph 15 at the last sentence of the main paragraph before the bullets, I believe what you're representing is the O&M that would go into the PCAM is identified in these bullets and estimated in ADD 17, right?
Correct.
Okay, and were you here when we talked about the amount of this being 6.3 million of those 3 bullets?
Yes.
Okay, and is that in addition to the 8.4 above that?
Yes.
Okay, so that's 14.7 that would go into the PCAM as you've agreed here.
I didn't do the math in my head, but yes, I believe it adds up to just about that.
And I know that these are estimates, so I want to look at ADD 17. And the ADD 17 is, my understanding of that is that's the total revenue requirement on an annual basis for the gas plant. Is that correct?
It's the estimated, an estimated revenue requirement. Yes.
Right, and it might change once we get further down the road here. But what I want to know is there anything in ADD 17 that you would intend to pull into the PCAM at a later date from ADD 17, or is the filing intended to be limited to the specific itemized costs here? And I understand they're estimated, so, but as identified here, they're at 14.7 million.
Can I ask to clarify?
Yeah.
So is the question, so when you look at paragraph 15, it identifies specific cost categories by FERC account.
Correct.
Are you asking whether or not the intention under paragraph 15 is to include more than is specified here within these cost categories?
Let me ask it a different way. Maybe, well, I think we're on the same road to the result here, but I want to be clear. Is this paragraph 15 intended to be a subset of ADD 17?
So the costs specified in paragraph 15 are a very limited subset of the total costs that would be associated with a complete revenue requirement of Yellowstone Generating Station. So this is a very small subset of the total cost of what would be involved in the cost of Yellowstone Generating Station.
Okay, and so it would be your intent, if everything goes perfectly as you envision here and want it to go, that when you would make a follow-on filing for a reset of the PCAM, the costs that you would include in it would be those specified here only in paragraph 15.
So if the commission were to adopt the settlement agreement, the paragraph 15 would allow for the inclusion of these costs limited to Yellowstone Generating Station for a temporary period of time prior to a future rate case where the full costs would be able to be addressed.
Okay, let's move on. The other night when you sent out the exhibits, Excel spreadsheets of the exhibits that we just went through and were admitted, there were PDF versions of those. Are those the same as the Excel spreadsheets? You know?
They are the PDF versions of those Excel spreadsheets.
Okay, great. And maybe if we could mark those and use those as well, that would be great, just for purposes of ease of use and sending around. Shannon, would that be all right?
We're marking the exact same exhibit.
There were Excel spreadsheets and PDF versions of the same exhibit. So 48, 49, I think you sent PDFs as well. And I just wanted to clarify that we could have those marked.
I think there are 2 versions of the same exhibit. And so I think it would be really confusing to mark them both.
All right, we can move on. That's just a housekeeping matter. Wanted to clarify that. Thanks. Cindy, the 14.7 that we just talked about, that increase that Northwestern would be seeking at some point, would be in addition to the 150 million that you're requesting here total today, correct?
Can you point me to the 150?
Certainly. So we can just add it up from the settlement agreement. And you've been here for the last couple of days, right?
Mhm.
Okay. So the base cost in paragraph 8, the revenue increase is 81.9, right? Was that a yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And then in paragraph 10, the gas increase is 18.2, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then over in paragraph 13, the PCAM adjustment is increasing the base to 208, right?
Yes.
And we're currently at 138. And if you haven't heard the testimony of the witnesses throughout the last couple of days, that's what the number has been that they've been discussing.
Mhm.
Okay. And so the difference between 138 and 208 is roughly 70.
Well, I think to be clear, when thinking about this, also includes the property tax. The property tax is really just, at least my understanding of property tax is it's a flow through. So as far as the need to increase those costs, Northwestern really has no control over what those costs are. This is what we are obligated to pay. And
Thank you, Cindy. That's not my question. So you asked me where we're getting the 150. Those three numbers add up to about actually a little more than 150, don't they?
well, and I think the characterization
Mr.
of,
President, the witness will be free to give narrative answers. I would ask that she just be directed to answer. This will go much more quickly if I can just get yes or no questions.
Ms. Fang, I agree with Mr. Nell.
okay,
Your counsel will have the opportunity to re-examine you. Please proceed.
I'll move on. Thank you, Mr. President. Cindy, in the planning and the assessment of what resources you need and, well, let me back up. And you testified that you have spent $1 billion in investments since the last rate case. That was your testimony as I heard it. Is that right?
I did state that, yes.
Okay. The last rate case was, the final order was entered at the end of 2020, correct?
I believe that's correct.
Actually, that's not true. It was the end of 2019. I'm sorry. December of 2019 was the final order. And the order on reconsideration was May of 2020, right?
I wasn't part of that rate case, so
Okay.
I'll, subject to check, sure.
Okay. And you're using a test year of 2021 in this case, correct?
Yes,
Okay. So Northwestern's testimony is that you spent $1 billion in investments between December of 2019 and 2021, December of 2021.
I believe that is between both natural gas and electric, and it would have been since the costs that were addressed in those rate cases, not necessarily until the end of the resolution of those rate cases.
Okay, fair enough. From the test year of the 2018
Mhm.
case. Okay. What did you buy for $1 billion?
We have, I believe it's almost 20 operations witnesses as part of this case that talk in quite detail about the investments that the utility has made during that time.
Okay, and I was just limiting it to what she had said. So, all right. So as part of all of your planning and preparation, have you factored carbon emissions into any of your planning?
When you think about the objectives, there's included in the testimony of Mr. Cashel, as well as I believe Mr. Carmody, they talk about the 4 drivers that we have behind our investments. They are capacity, reliability, asset life, and compliance. So those are the primary goals when we think about our investment priorities and how do we ensure safe and reliable service for our customers.
Thank you, Cindy, for that answer. Can we go back to my question? Do you remember it?
Yes, and there is consideration of carbon when we think about our obligations to our customers, and that's reflected in our net zero plan.
Okay, and in the carbon emissions that will and the methane from the plant, did Northwestern assess that or take that into account in any way before building the gas plant in Laurel?
I was not involved in the specifics as far as that selection. I believe Mr. Hines can best answer that.
And are you aware of the fact that Montana customers are today paying $247 million of costs attributable to a carbon tax that the utility represented was sure to happen in 2014? Are you aware of that? Yes or no?
Objection. That mischaracterizes any evidence in the record and misstates facts. It also is far beyond the scope of her testimony. The settlement.
Mr. Nell,
A couple follow-up, Mr. President, if I may.
so are you withdrawing the question?
No, not. I have a.
I'm going to sustain the objection then.
Okay, thank you. As this settlement is postured in paragraph 15, you would be asking for the ratepayers of Northwestern and Montana to be paying for operation and maintenance expenses of a plant that has not been reviewed and put into rate base. Do I have that right?
Paragraph 15 asks for the recovery limited to the operations and maintenance of a plant that would be in service, providing benefits to customers on an interim basis, subject to the prudence review that would occur in that filing.
Where does the word interim appear in paragraph 15?
I think you heard the testimony of Crystal Lael earlier in this week say that it would be on an interim basis.
Ms. Fang, my question is, does the word interim appear in paragraph 15?
Given that the provision is that the recovery of O&M would begin on the in-service date and the prudence may follow that, our expectation is that it would be on an interim basis.
Is the word interim in paragraph 15, yes or no?
No.
Thank you. Mr. President, I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Trunnell. HRC.
I actually have a suggestion, Mr. Chairman. I have some for Ms. Fang, not a huge amount, but some. She's been up there for an hour and a half. I suspect she could use a break. I know I could use a break. How about it?
Well, I would say by the reaction of all the parties here that your request will be granted. So the time is now 2:37. Why don't we take a 13-minute break, which would bring us back at 2:50. It is again, it's 2:37. We will go off the record.
That's fair. Yeah, I think that's. I don't want to.
Well, so that was good. Can you hear the house? Have some. Yeah. Yeah. It's only, it's like, it's a part of it. Yeah, that was. You said that like, wait, it's 6. That's a bad. It's just.
All right. Time's now 2:53 PM. We'll go back on the record. We had left off HRC and cross-examination.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Ms. Fang.
Good afternoon.
I heard you on direct talk about the role or about the cost of service studies and their role in the settlement discussions. Do you remember that conversation?
Yes.
Is it fair to say that the cost of service studies that were performed by the settling parties, and I'm just going to focus on the electric side, just in my question, performed a start, and those cost of service studies were performed by Northwestern and the large customer group. Is that correct? That those cost of service studies served kind of as a starting point in the settlement negotiations, something that the settling parties referenced and developed positions around. Is that a fair characterization?
I think reference versus starting point might be the more correct characterization, because as you heard from the other parties, for Northwestern, we also believe that the cost of service studies are an important reference, but that needs to be balanced with what the implications are to customers compared to where they are today. You know, when you think about cost of service studies, and this is discussed in my direct testimony, you know, you have to make sure that you are thinking about customer implications, what the impacts will look like, in addition to how do you move towards more cost-based rates and allocation.
Yep, and I agree with that, and you kind of anticipated, I think, my next couple of questions. The first of which is there are many different ways to do cost of service studies. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
And cost of service studies that are intended to identify, examine, allocate utility costs can come up with different results.
Absolutely.
Now, 2021 was the test year that your rate case used. Is that correct?
Correct.
And life in the United States during 2021 and pretty much everywhere was impacted by the COVID pandemic, was it not?
Correct.
What is your understanding of how load and demand by customer class was impacted by the pandemic in 2021?
At a very high level, and you saw this pretty much across the country, that with COVID, you had many people transition from work in your traditional workplace, work office, move to work at home. So you saw residential usage go up, and you saw a decline in usage across, in particular, small business groups and other businesses as well, due to COVID.
And did on Northwestern's system that residential consumption increased and the consumption of larger users, industrial users, decreased during that period? Relative to the test year that was established in the prior, sorry to interrupt your thought. I just wanted to clarify my question. However, so when I said increase and decrease, I really was referencing your test year assumptions in other words, whether or not you were going to be able to hit your revenue requirement based on the consumption of those particular classes.
If I recall correctly, my understanding of what occurred is at the total level, it was not necessarily a material difference. It really was a shift in that usage between the classes. And compared to the test year from the prior rate case, that is my understanding of those results. And what we saw with the 2021 test year loads is that a lot of those effects had started to rebound. So they were starting to approach what might be best labeled as sort of more closer to pre-COVID conditions, if I recall correctly.
Right. And I am interested in the kind of the interclass or group differences here. So are you aware of the filings that Northwestern made to defer or delay or put on hold the decoupling pilot?
Yes.
Are you aware that that in those filings, Northwestern argued that because residential customers saw a higher degree of consumption, that meant that Northwestern was going to over recover its allocated revenue requirement associated with that class. Hence, that class would need a rebate, but that Northwestern was getting hit from the other direction in the sense that large users, industrial users were not consuming as much electricity. Hence, Northwestern was under recovering. So the overall impact to Northwestern was either neutral or negative based on the fact that consumption had dropped so much in the larger class categories. Are you aware of that?
That is my recollection, yes.
So if the pandemic resulted in measurable changes to customer consumption and energy behaviors in 2021, wouldn't this impact the cost class of service?
So my understanding is that the material impacts occurred primarily in 2020 and had returned to a large degree by the 2021 test year. And in addition, there were adjustments that were made on the residential side to account for the fact that there was still some COVID, I don't know how else to characterize it, just that carryover, the COVID impacts.
So your testimony is that, as you just stated, let me just make sure I'm understanding that, that in 2021, that there was no significant impact, no measurable impact versus 2021 as a result of the pandemic?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Let me. I think actually that there's the record in this proceeding will have the consumption data for the years that we're talking about. So we can look at that and determine it. So rather than try to belabor this point, I'm just going to continue. So let's assume that the a cost of service based on a 2021 test year would show a significant degree of impact as a result of the pandemic in terms of energy consumption and energy usage as between the classes. Let's assume that's the case, okay? For 2021, for the test year that you used. Are you with me?
I understand the assumption.
Okay, cool. So based on that assumption, would using a 2021 test year show a higher allocation of cost to the residential and small commercial classes in that, based on that assumption, in that event?
If there continue to be COVID impacts and there was no adjustment to account for that, yes, that would be the result.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now we're gonna go back to some of the questions that I asked Ms. Whale, and who punt it over to you. So, and one of the questions you addressed on your direct, but I'm going to confess that I did not understand your conversation with your counsel with regard to this particular issue. So I'm going to ask you to try to tutor me, and I may not understand it. It's very helpful to have for me to have things written down. But on Exhibit C of the settlement agreement, there's a category there called generation adder. And I heard you say to your counsel that this is some, I don't know if some way to address the interaction between the choice and the non-choice customers. Could you please explain that for me again? And I'm just give you one shot at it. I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to belabor it.
So in looking at the revenue allocation, so if we go back to table 1 that's in the settlement agreements, it had expected impacts for each of the customer groups. Within those customer groups, you will have choice and non-choice customers. And when you think about what choice and non-choice customers are paying, non-choice customers, you have the addition of generation energy supply costs. And how do you make sure that the two groups continue to see approximate, so for residential, we were talking 18.2%. How do you make sure both choice and non-choice customers within that group pay approximately 18.2% when a whole cost category is not paid for by one of those groups? And so what we did, given how the base T and fixed gen were defined in exhibits A and B, we had those constraints. And so in order to be able to bring the impacts of choice and non-choice closer together, what we did was the creation of that generation adder to move some of those T and D costs to bring the impacts to choice and non-choice customers level. Did that make sense?
I think I followed most of that. And like I promised, I'm not going to belabor it, so I'm going to move on. So thank you for that explanation. So another question I had related to Exhibit D in the settlement agreement and the asterisk that is next to the word current. And my question was, and if you go to the very last page of Exhibit D, you'll see the definition of asterisk, which is current has been adjusted to reflect stipulated revenue allocation numbers. And I was confused by that because you've got 3 headings there: current, settlement, and change. And I was also confused because Exhibit C uses those same headings, but the asterisk is not there. So can you explain what's going on?
Yes, and I apologize. I did try to explain it when I was discussing the natural gas work papers. So one of the, we identified as we were developing the settlement numbers that there was a difference in the rate revenues across 2 of the statements. While the total statement revenue numbers were the same in both statements, there was a difference in the rate revenue numbers. And so we had to adjust current rates to match the way the numbers showed up in the stipulation so that the increase was how it's stated in the stipulation. So if
this is just for gas.
Just for gas. It was only on the gas side. Apparently the way the 2 statements report, it's slightly different on the natural gas side than it is on the electric side. And so if I can point you to table 2 what we did is basically adjusted current rates at the time of filing to make sure the revenues associated with that tied to the 150 and settlement tied to the 168 to make sure that the incremental impact was the 18.2.
Where does the 18.2 come from?
I'm sorry, the 18.22 million.
Oh, got it. Okay. Because that was the same number as increase on the collector side.
Sorry.
So in a way, it was an effort on, this may be a mischaracterization on my part, but you were trying to do, in effect, an apples to apples comparison here. By
Correct.
this adjustment.
And to make sure that when we set the new rates, that the incremental impact would be limited to the increase identified in this table.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. What exhibit is it? It's the work paper exhibit, and you talked about this with your counsel. I don't think you'll need it.
Okay.
Yeah. The property tax and the fact that the increase in the property tax was excluded to the GS1 primary group and the GS2 transmission group. And that was in that box at the, well, maybe you do need it. I don't know. You did talk about it with your counsel.
Correct. So when you look at table 1, GS1 primary and GS2 transmission, the allocation provides for a 0% increase to those two customer groups. And the way we developed the settlement rates for them was literally to set the rates equal, both for base rates as well as property tax rates.
Right. Okay. So those groups did not see any property tax increase. And I suspect I know the answer as to why, but I'd like to ask you, if you know, and only if you know, what is the explanation for that?
Could you repeat that?
So the GS1 primary and the GS2 transmission groups were assigned a 0%. No, they were excluded from the allocation of the increase in the property tax. Correct?
Correct.
Why?
To be it was a simplifying assumption when we looked at how to implement the 0% increase, which tying to the total revenues, including both base revenue requirements and property tax, we applied it as a simplifying assumption.
And why did those groups receive a 0% increase?
This was in looking at the cost of service and how do we manage between cost of service and moderation for these groups, depending on the cost study, they would have. So historically, these two groups have been subsidizing the other customer classes.
Yep. Okay. I'm following you. And that's what I thought. Okay. Let's move to ever popular paragraph 15 really quickly. And I was not intending to ask you this question, but I'm going to. So paragraph 15, and there's been a lot of talk about what's in, what you can ask the commission to put in the PCAM base reset and what you can't. And we know there are 4 items that are specifically identified in paragraph 15 as ones that you can specifically ask the commission to include in that PCAM base reset. There's a gas transmission reservation charge, and then there are the 3 O&M categories there in the bullets at the bottom of that paragraph, right?
Correct.
Okay. I don't know how to put this. That's not all that you're going to ask for to be included in that PCAM base reset. Isn't that correct? And by that, I mean, aren't you gonna ask for just plain ordinary fuel costs to be included in that base PCAM base reset, as opposed to, which is different than the gas transmission reservation charge? Again, if you know, and this is not a big deal, it's more like me reading this going, I think maybe there's going to be more.
Could I refer back to ADD 17? Do you mind if I?
No, I don't mind. I'm not sure that's going to help you though, because that's a revenue requirement, part of this exhibit.
I would expect us to request recovery of fuel costs for the operations of plant once in service.
Okay.
And I believe that that's not noted, given that it's
I'm following.
already
you.
within the
I'm following
PCAM
you.
provision.
I'm
So
following you. Thank you.
Would you let her answer the question, please? We have a study record.
I
Thank you.
apologize. Did you answer the question?
that it's not called out because it would follow the existing, my understanding, the PCAM is it's got specific FERC accounts and definitions that falls within those specific categories.
Thank you, Ms. Fang. No further questions.
Okay, Mr. Uda, are you online? Mr. Uda?
This is Lowell Chandler. I can see that Michael unmuted, but he was unable to actually speak. But Broadreach does not have any questions for Ms. Fang.
Thank you, Mr. Chandler. Renewable.
And Renewable Northwest does not have any questions from Ms. Fang.
All right, thank you. MEIC?
Yes, just a few questions. Malcolm Gilbert.
Okay, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Ms. Fang. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
You don't have it in front of you, but a couple of questions regarding the work paper exhibit MEIC 3. There's a $27 million figure that represents coal strip assets, and I'm wondering what the elements of that rate represent.
I don't have the specific cost categories that follow into that. My understanding is that given the distinct treatment of coal strip and thinking about revenue requirements and all of those other issues, that it's historically been represented distinctly within those rate components in that manner.
Okay, and how would you square that, if you're able to answer? How would you square that with the $46 million settlement that was proposed by Northwestern in the 2018 rate case? Like, how would you compare those two values and why they're different?
So what I can speak to is how that particular component within those work papers are handled. So what that has in place is the current effective rate component within that. And then what is applied to get to the settlement rates is it's a similar factor that's applied to all the generation, the fixed gen components. So the equivalent factor is applied to that piece as well as the other fixed gen pieces.
Okay, so I think that this gets at the next question that I have, which is that and again, you're not looking at it, but in rows 52 and 53, there's a 1.46% value, which I think is a multiplier that's used to, I guess, come up with the settlement value as compared with the present value for that same figure.
Yes, so I believe the way, not having the workbook in front of me, but I believe that should track to what you'll see as a identified target factor. That is sort of, so each of the rate schedules is blocked out. So at the very bottom of each of those blocks for each of the rate schedules, you should see targets. And it should be tying to those targets. And those targets would have been on the rate design tab, would have been tied back to the initial setup that is on the allocation tab for that rate schedule. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And so does that multiplier, that target factor, apply equally to other assets besides Colstrip?
It would have been one factor for the fixed gen component within base rates.
Okay. That's all. Thank you.
Oh, one clarification. With the exception of the generation adder and the generation demand charge.
Any additional questions? Okay. This will be the time for commissioner questioning. Vice President Fielding.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Fang, regarding the LCG 5 cost of service, it's Exhibit 5, the cost of service allocation study. I'm looking specifically at the settlement revenue allocation of 18.2% for the residential category, the residential class.
Mhm.
Okay. So I've got that number there. And then on the Northwestern Energy NWE 48, page 1. I'm specifically looking at line 27, column K. 7.6% estimated increase or impact to the residential bill. So I understand that the 18.2% LCG 5 is a increase in revenue requirement. I'm hoping for some clarification on why the impact to the monthly bill is expected to be 7.6% above and beyond current rates when the revenue requirement is expected to be 18.2% against the current revenue requirement. Can you help me understand the difference there?
Yes, LCG 5, the at current rates is the rates that were in effect at the time of the filing, our initial filing. So those rates would have been August 1st, 2022 rates. Whereas Exhibit Northwestern 48 is looking at rates customers are paying today. So the difference between what's reflected in LCG 5 and Northwestern 48 is the implementation of interim rates plus property tax and a few roll-on, roll-offs of deferrals that occurred between August and today.
Okay, so that was your explanation of the 18.2% then that's in LCG 5?
Yes.
Okay. So we're not comparing apples to apples there because LCG 5 is making a comparison of the settlement to the rates that were in effect prior to this filing being made, whereas this NWE 48 is making a comparison as to what the impact on a customer's bill will be against the rates they're currently paying at this time.
Correct.
Do you have the figure, maybe you've covered it somewhere, on what that difference is on the customer bill impact? So we can compare apples to apples in NWE 48 with, I'm looking for what is the increase total from the beginning of, before this case was filed? What is the total impact on the monthly bill to the residential customer?
If I can refer you to Northwestern 50,
Yes.
that will show, so we have the August 2022 bills. That first line will be the residential customer, assuming 750 kilowatt hours of usage. So you can see that between August and March, so the rates they're paying today, their bill went from 91.27 to 108.39. So that's the difference between rates that were in effect when we first filed versus rates in effect today. And then going from the rates today to the settlement, that additional difference going from 108.39 to 116.63.
And is that represented by the 28%?
So going from August 22 to the settlement would be the 28%.
Okay.
And included in that is, we have interim, we have the PCAM, and then in addition to that, that's where you see sort of the difference in the settlement implementation being 8%.
Okay, because this NWE 50 factors in PCAM supply costs that were basically passed through costs that Northwestern had to pay, and under collections from, I guess you might call that regulatory lag. Is that correct? From past rates that were under collected?
Yeah, so there are some deferred balances in the PCAM that are captured that changed between August and rates today.
And property taxes as well kicked in.
Correct.
Okay. Am I understanding this correctly? I'm back on NWE 48. And I'm on line 30, column H. The property, the state and local taxes are 14.6% of the bill customers will pay if the settlement is increased. Is that correct?
Compared to a 15.5 that they're paying today, correct.
Okay, so there's a slight reduction in property tax. But that is still, I'm trying to understand how to say this in layman's terms, if this settlement is accepted, is the customer to expect that 14.6% of that increase is attributed to the increased in or the property taxes? Am I reading that right? Or can you rephrase how to interpret that number of 14.6%?
I think if you're looking at the property tax, it's important to look at the same line, so line 29, but looking at column E. So it's really the comparison of E to H across that property tax line.
I see that, and I see that in E, the property tax was $16.81, and this is the average typical bill. Yeah. And that represented 15.5% of the total bill. And then in H, property tax is estimated at $17.08, which would be 14.6% of the customer's total bill, right?
Yeah, and so basically property tax is effectively 15%, like approximately on both sides. And if you think about it in terms of percentages, one of the things that's moving is the underlying bill, the total bill is going up a little bit. So that's why the percentage is shifting a little. But if you look at the dollar in property tax, it's 16.81 to 17.08. So there's a small, the property tax, while it's a notable portion of a customer's bill, it's 15%. The change from the rates today to what's being implemented is going to be small when you think about property tax impact.
Can you help me understand these property taxes? They didn't kick in the interim rates. We didn't allow the property taxes to be applied last October when the interim rate went into effect, correct?
Correct. They went in on January 1 with the property tax tracker update.
Okay. So those triggered a increase in customers' bill effective January 1st.
Correct.
Okay. And what do you know what percentage of increase in the bill or what kind of impact, total impact that had on customers' bills at that time?
I don't have that before me, but happy to provide that.
Would you expect it to be similar to the 15% number that is consistent, roughly consistent with these other two figures that are on this worksheet? If you don't know, that's fine.
I don't know. I think it's somewhere in that ballpark, but there would have been an increase because we were updating the base for the most current property tax amount. So I do believe there would have been an impact. I just don't know what the specific impact would be, but property tax is, it's a double-digit portion of the customer bill.
Okay. Mr. President, that's all for right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vice President Fielder. Commissioner Pinochi.
Thank you, Mr. President. Testimony shows that a typical household has an increase of 28%. Can you tell me what the rate increase for large customer group, say Walmart, is?
So what I have, so if we look at Northwestern 48, I don't have any specifics on Walmart usage per se, but I can, we do have a couple of typical bills for that customers on that schedule. Does that work?
Well, I understand that they're not going to go up any percentage at all, zero.
Oh, that they are part of the, my understanding is they're part of the GS1 secondary. So theirs is increasing.
How much?
So if you go back to the settlement table 1, their group is going up 13.6%. That schedule, it's the GS1 secondary.
So Walmart's going up 13%. Typical households going up 28%. You were asked what you thought was fair or not. Do you feel that's fair?
Well, I want to clarify. So if you look at the settlement agreements, the residential would go up 18.2% since rates that were in effect back in August. So the 28% that's been presented, that includes other changes that have been outside of this rate case that have occurred since that time. So I think 18% from the beginning of this case to where we are today from the settlement is probably a better representation. I think it's also important to remember that what customers will actually see is the difference between if this settlement were approved and where we are today. You know, we're expecting that percentage to be closer to 7.6%. And when we think about it in those terms, we do think it, you know, I do think it is reasonable. And we do hear your concerns about affordability, which is why we've been so actively making sure our customers are aware of all this assistance programs we have available.
Here today, large customer group has representation. My ratepayer that has a fixed income, mostly retired. What representation do they have in the room today?
Well, I believe MCC is a very strong, represents them very, very strongly. I also believe that Northwestern, we care about our customers. So I believe that we also represent those customers.
I think they rely on their public service commissioner because they elect us. So I'm going to practice that a little bit. A few years ago, there was a bill called House Bill 411 that took millions of dollars, added to the electric bill, and then given to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Now, my retired and fixed income were very concerned about that because they don't feel that they should be given money to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. They feel that they should be paying their electric bill, right? Maybe what we could do, working together to represent the retired fixed income ratepayer, Northwest Energy and the Public Service Commission, and perhaps the Montana Consumer Council could go to the legislature and say, look, let's stop giving that money to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and let's get that money to, say, Northwestern Energy so they can use it the way they need to. Do you think that's reasonable for us to make that goal?
Mr. Chairman, I would gently object to this being outside the scope of the settlement.
It's this type of situation that puts me in a very difficult position, to say the least. This is so far beyond the scope of this proceeding. It's not even remotely relevant, Commissioner Pinochi. But Ms. Fang, to the extent that you can provide some response to this question, I would appreciate it.
Northwestern would be happy to work with the commission and MCC to see what else we can be doing for our residential customers.
What I'm trying to do here is represent my district. Okay, they're seeing a sharp increase. I'm just trying to be inventive to come up with some ideas to help out. And I think it's important for the record that this Public Service Commission voted to stand against House Bill 411, not to add any money to the electric bill to give it to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And what surprised me is when I went up there to testify against the bill to represent the ratepayer, Northwest Energy testified to pass that bill. So I'm just trying to come up with a solution here, okay? Another idea could be that we introduce legislation that
Commissioner
would remove.
Pinochi, this is far beyond the scope of this proceeding. If you would like to engage the parties at a different time outside the scope of this contested case proceeding, you're certainly more than welcome to do so. Do you have any questions for this witness related to any evidence in this matter?
No more questions, Mr. President.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Pinochi. Commissioner Bukajek?
No question, Mr. President.
All right, I don't have any questions at this time, Mr. Hamilton.
Mr. President, thank you. Just a few points that I'll maybe try to clarify. The exhibit behind you referred to Northwestern Energy's original revenue requirement request of $102.8 million. Do you recall discussing that with Ms. Trinnell?
I do recall that discussion.
The $102.8 million, is it your understanding that that does or does not include property tax?
When I think about the presentation of our case, we actually made a point to really clarify the distinction between base and property tax. And my recollection, when I think about my testimony and numbers included in that testimony, it focused on base revenue requirements. So I think I was clear in saying that that was my understanding, but I would have to confirm.
Could we refer you to the transmittal letter that was submitted with this application? And specifically page 2 of that letter. And there's a paragraph. After 2 bullet points, there's a paragraph and then another paragraph. The first sentence of that paragraph, I believe, reads, Northwestern requests approval of an increase in its electric base revenue requirement in the amount of $91,770,237. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree with me that that is the base revenue requirement requested in Northwestern's original application?
Yes. So I would need to correct my statement from earlier.
So is it fair to say that the 102 million, which I believe is the sum of your base revenue requirement request, and the $11.1 million in property tax adjustment that's discussed later in that sentence, that is the sum of both base revenue requirement and property tax?
Correct.
So the $81.9 million figure from the settlement is a combination of base revenue and property taxes. Is that correct?
Yes. So that would mean the 81 and the 102 would be apples to apples.
Perfect. And for the sake of more apples, $91.7 million is directly comparable to the settlement's $67.3 or $0.4 million.
Correct.
Thank you. Could I now refer you to NWE Exhibit 50? All right, you're there?
Yes.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the column of March 2023 and what adjustments were included in there. I believe that you actually discussed this with Vice President Fielder earlier, but if I could, I'd like to put some numbers to it. Is it fair to say that the March 2023 column reflects the interim adjustment to the base revenue requirement of $29.4 million that was approved in this case in effective October 1?
I don't have that number before me, but I do believe that's correct.
Would it also include, and I appreciate that, and if you don't have these numbers in front of you, that's fine. They can be subject to check. But it would also include a $61.1 million interim increase in the base PCAM costs, which was effective October 1 of 2022. Is that correct?
Subject to check, yes.
And the PCAM docket, the annual PCAM true-up for this year had included a deferred account balance and under collection of $52.8 million. And that is also reflected presently in the March 2023 rate. Is that correct?
Correct.
And finally, the tax tracker adjustment that you mentioned earlier that took effect on January 1 of 2023, that would be $10.8 million.
Subject to check, correct.
Are there any other roll-on or roll-off deferrals that were reflected between August of 2022 and March of 2023 besides the ones that we've just discussed?
I do believe there's a lower deferred balance in the PCAM base in the 8/1/2022 of 18 million from the prior period.
Very good. That's a good point. Thank you. So let's look ahead now, if we could, to October 1 of 2023. The commission, as I mentioned earlier, has approved an interim base adjustment for the PCAM as part of this docket, correct?
Correct.
And as a result, we should expect that on October 1 of 2023, the deferred balance that needs to be rolled into rates and collected should not be as high as $52.8 million. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
So is it reasonable to, I understand that this is a prediction right now, right? You don't have actual supply costs for the remainder of the tracking period yet, but based on the commission's prior approval of a base adjustment in this docket to that PCAM, you would expect to see the deferred balance that needs to be rolled into rates as of October of this year to be lower than the deferred balance that is being paid currently.
Assuming all things equal, I do believe that's correct. As far as something more, the more specific context, I believe Joe Steinmetz might be able to provide better information.
Very well. We may follow up on this with Mr. Steinmetz. Last question. You mentioned during cross-examination some adjustments that were made to the cost of service study to reflect the lingering effects of COVID in 2021. Do you recall that
Yes.
statement? Can you be more specific for me and describe what adjustments were made in that cost of service study?
There were adjustments made to the load assumptions on residential. And I don't have the specific site, but it's noted in direct testimony that we did an additional adjustment on residential load, right? You know, with the assumption that we were continuing to head towards normal.
And just to be clear, is that your direct testimony or the direct testimony of another witness?
I believe it is in my direct testimony.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. President. I have nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Time for recross. Ms. Trinnell?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to just come back to my exhibit 26 here based on the answers that we just got and add in that number, which I wrote down quickly from the application. And I think to address Mr. Nelson's concern about appropriate citations. So Ms. Fang, I think you just said in response to the staff's question that we have here, this should be 91, 770, 273, correct?
I believe that's correct. I don't have the number in front of me anymore.
Okay, and then to address Mr. Nelson's concern about citing to where that comes from the transmittal letter. So if I write here, transmittal letter, that should take care of that concern. And then I'll put next to the 102, that was your initial request.
I think the concern
Which
about
we had I'm sorry, I just wanted to finish my sentence there. This one had the taxes in it, the 11,000 of taxes, right?
correct. I think the question about labeling was to be able to identify which ones were base revenue requirement versus which ones were base plus property tax.
Okay. My follow-up with Mr. Nelson was for appropriate citations for some poor law clerk in 20 years who may be sorting through these records. Is that fair, Mr. Nelson? I'm trying to take care of the concern so we can get this into the record here, Mr. President.
Mr. Nelson?
I will simply say that if Ms. Fang as the witness is comfortable with how the information is described on the sheet, I'm happy.
Okay.
So I would defer to the expert.
Thank you. Mr. President, may I continue?
Yep, please proceed.
Thank you. So the apples to apples here then would be the 46.5 here that we have marked now with this arrow on the bottom, that's apples to apples, considering with the 66.7 here and the 81 here and the 91. Is that right?
No, I believe it's the 46, the 66.7, the 81.9, and the 102. 8, 9.
Okay. The 81 and then the 102.
And I think the labeling of
Okay.
whether it is base only or base plus property tax will help make sure we're keeping apples to apples.
Okay, so to do that then is the 105 base plus property?
Yes.
Okay, so can we do base plus property taxes here? Is that what you
Yes.
said? Okay, and the 102 is also base plus property?
Yep. All the 5 we just identified. basically.
Okay, so here, base plus property taxes, I put PT there, so the record will reflect that. I'm trying to speed this up, Mr. President. Plus property taxes, the 66.7 is base plus property, and the 46 is base plus property. Okay. So I would move then for the admission of 350 Exhibit 26 with those clarifications.
Or Mr. Nelson? Absolutely. I'll withhold ruling on the admission of the amended exhibit at this point. All right, Ms. Nelson,
Ms.
Nave or
Fang,
Dwyer.
sorry. Ms. Fang, relative to the 66 million that is the MCC's filed case and the 46 million, which is the LCG's filed case, what is your basis for concluding that those numbers are inclusive of property taxes?
I have no basis for concluding that other than it was in the same sheet that I was provided initially as a reference point compared to the Northwestern's 102.
Which, so the record's clear, came from the fact sheet at, I think it was page 19. So
I understand.
if you want to look at that, Thor.
I appreciate that, but Ms. Fang and Mike, well, I will raise an objection to this admission. I believe the record will show that this assumes facts not in evidence. The fact sheet is not in evidence. And I believe, and I don't want to testify here, but I believe the evidence will show that the 66 and the 46 are not inclusive of property taxes. And so I think that the exhibit is potentially misleading and incorrect.
Northwestern would join that objection.
Mr. President, in terms of rules of evidence, if Mr. Nelson wants to cross-examine the witness, he certainly had the opportunity to do all of that. If there's a relevance or a summary objection, the rules of evidence address those specifically, and it would certainly be admissible as a summary exhibit of underlying information, especially in this kind of a proceeding.
Okay, then I appreciate that. And I will add an objection that there is insufficient foundation for this exhibit as the witness has testified under voir dire that she does not know if the 46 million and the 66 million is inclusive of property taxes or not.
Mr. No.
You know what, Mr. President, I will reserve and take another run at this after I have a chance to look at that. And that is, again, I think just illustrative of trying to do this on the run. So thank you.
Okay, so at this point in time, exhibit 26 as amended during this colloquy is not admitted.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't have any further questions.
HRC. Mr. Uda.
Mr. President, this is Lowell Chandler again on behalf of Broadreach. We have no questions. I'm sure Mr. Uda can't speak because his mic is not working.
Mr. Chandler, would you just like me to forego asking if you would have any cross-examination questions at this point in time, or?
Yeah, that would be okay.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Renewable Northwest,
No questions, Mr. President. Thanks.
MEIC. Hold on one second, please. Right, Ms. Heim.
I only have about an hour or so. I'm kidding. I promise I'm kidding. Ms. Fang, I just have a couple items I would like to clarify. I am going to do this kind of chronologically through the cross-examination and commission questions that you received. Ms. Tranel, early on when she was cross-examining you, she had asked you a question and she had cut off your answer and you had wanted to expand on it. Of course, now I'm trying to remember. It was related to the LCG and finding, the original position of the LCG related to revenue requirement credible. And whether or not the commission, if it wanted to adopt that and move forward, whether that was a possibility. And so you said yes, and then wanted to expand your answer. I'd like to give you the opportunity now to more fully expand on that.
My recollection was it was the question about whether or not the hypothetical of if the commission were to adopt LCG's initially proposed revenue requirements and instead of the settlement agreements. The point I wanted to add is that while it certainly is possible for the commission to make that decision, it seems like it would be challenging since LCG is a signatory to the settlement.
Okay. Would you encourage the commission to reject the settlement and instead pick and parse positions of the settling parties?
You know, I recommend my recommendation is that the commission adopt the settlements. I do believe that the settling parties well represent the customers of Montana. It was work for everybody to find a mutually agreeable settlement to address all of the customers that would be impacted by this rate case. And all of the settling parties, they take the impacts to the customers. They take those concerns very seriously. We do believe we came to a reasonable settlement. Everybody has just about the same level of happiness and unhappiness associated with that. There was a lot of give and take in those discussions, and we do recommend that the commission adopt the settlement.
Thank you. Ms. Tranel was referring you to the $150 million question, or this figure that it's been thrown around a lot. Do you believe it's a fair representation of the settlement to include all of the flow through costs, including the PCAM base update, the property taxes, the other supply costs that are required to serve Northwestern's customers?
Well, I think when characterizing what Northwestern's ask is, I think it's not a correct representation to include in that all of the flow through costs. The structure of property taxes, we are required to play the role of collector of those property taxes. And so I think classifying that as well as the flow through costs associated with the PCAM, it doesn't seem like it's appropriately characterized as Northwestern's ask. our ask is associated with the base rates when we're thinking about the recovery of costs we've already incurred for assets in service, providing benefits to our customers.
Thank you. One of the questions Ms. Trinell asked you was, where did Northwestern spend $1 billion? And I think you clarified the test year comparison, but I want to make sure the record is clear. Can you identify the time period that Northwestern spent approximately $1 billion in upgrades into its electric and natural gas systems?
So the $1 billion invested, and it's a little over, I don't have the exact numbers before me, but it's over 800 million on the electric side, well over 200 million on the gas side in infrastructure investments to serve our customers here in Montana. These occurred between the cost recovery periods associated with our last two rate cases. So this is our 2018 electric rate case with a 2017 test year, costs associated with that 2017 test year, and our 2016 natural gas rate case with with test year costs of 2015. So it's since the timing and the cost recovery periods for those two rate cases that Northwestern has continued to invest in Montana, despite having our rates fixed at those historic levels.
So is it fair to say that Northwestern has carried the burden of that approximately $1 billion investment between these two rate reviews?
I believe it is a correct comparison. Northwestern is committed to safe and reliable service for our customers. And, so we continue to invest to make sure that we're able to continue our history of reliable service.
Great. I'd like to put Renewable Northwest 11 in front of you. Oh, is it 1? Sorry. My bad. It's getting late in the day. Renewable Northwest 1. So if you could take a look at that. Represent for the record that Renewable Northwest asked a Northwestern witness to identify basically that data. Is that correct?
So Renewable Northwest 1, the question asks, application on page 2 states, since Northwestern's last electric rate review in 2018 through 2021, it has invested approximately $835 million in electric transmission, distribution, and generation assets to benefit customers. Similarly, since Northwestern's last natural gas rate review in 2016 through 2021, it's invested approximately $267 million. And then the data request continues to ask for the breakdown in A and B for electric and natural gas respectively. And then the response identifies that 2 work papers were provided in response to that question.
Okay, thank you. So you had a conversation with Mr. McGraw about the load level shifts due to COVID. And so I want to talk about that just a little bit to make sure we're clear. So I've got a couple things. So do you remember Mr. McGraw asking you about how COVID affected the cost of service, the class cost of service studies?
My recollection is it was a discussion about how COVID affected the load and how the load could have, those load impacts could have implications to cost of service.
And are those cost of service studies based on a normalized load?
They are normalized, and in addition, there was an adjustment to account for our expectation of greater return to pre-COVID loads on residential.
And I believe you had already indicated for the record that that was part of your direct testimony, correct?
That is my recollection, but I don't have it before me and don't recall the site.
Is it fair to say that the COVID, the normalization that we did, even if there's some trailing lag that could be attributed to COVID, at the end of the day, the residential customer class is still being subsidized by the other classes, namely the commercial classes, the GS1, GS2?
Consistent with my recollection of prior cost of service studies, I do believe that the residential class has historically continued to be subsidized by other customer classes.
Do you recall that when Northwestern, this is in relation to the FCRM and the questions that Mr. McGraw asked you. Northwestern asked for the first deferral of the FCRM based on COVID impacts to the 2020 loads. Is that your recollection?
That is my recollection.
And then the second deferral, because there've been two, right? Two deferrals.
I
Now we're
believe that
to-
there've been more than one. Yes.
Was the second deferral based on COVID, or was it a deferral to move the issue to the rate review that was about to be filed or pending rate review?
There was a deferral that asked for the issue to be moved to this rate review.
Mr. McGraw suggested that maybe 2021 was a poor test year. If Northwestern had waited and used a 2022 test year with a 2023 known and measurable, do you expect that the revenue requirement ask of Northwestern would be higher or lower if we had waited?
I wouldn't be able to speculate to that. My understanding is that, there have been multiple questions about the timing of Northwestern's rate case. If there was the financial need, why did we not file sooner? And the sooner would have been in the midst of COVID. So the Northwestern filed this rate case because we needed to file this rate case.
But all of the capital investment that Northwestern made and is seeking to be recovered would have just rolled forward, correct? Would be $1 billion plus whatever we spent in the 2020 test year and the 2023 test year and a 2024 known and measurable.
There's a lot of moving parts. So, yes, but at the same time, then Northwestern also would have continued to have rates based on the 2018 electric rate case and 2016 gas rate case that would have continued to carry forward yet another year.
That's fair. I'd like to follow up on a question that Commissioner Panocci asked you about Walmart. He was comparing the Walmart rate from a different exhibit to the percent increase from Northwestern 50. So if you could pull out Northwestern 50, just so we could do an apples to apples comparison. Okay, are you there? Okay. So Can you look at, let's compare. So Walmart, my understanding Walmart is, they have a little of both, but is primarily a GS1 secondary non-demand customer. Is that correct?
My recollection is it was GS1 secondary. I do not know if it was non-demand or demand.
Okay.
I don't recall.
Okay. What are both of those percentages? I mean, I think they have a mix of both, but
So if we're looking at the change from August 2022 to settlements, it's 25% for non-demand and 24% for demand. If we're looking at the change from March 23rd to settlement, it's 3% for non-demand and 4% for demand.
okay. And I apologize for not asking that very articulately. I'm really looking at the August 2022 to settlement. Just because my recollection is Commissioner Pinocci had you focus on the 28% increase for the residential class.
So for GS1 secondary non-demand, that's 25%, and GS1 secondary demand, that's 24%.
So although the residential rate increase is higher, is it so substantially higher that it would give you cause to think it is inherently unfair?
When I think about the difference between a 28% increase and a 25% increase and a 24% increase, I think that they are relatively comparable.
That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I just need to advise Mr. President, yourself and the commission that I misspoke earlier with regards to exhibit 350 exhibit 26. During the redirect, I had a chance to go back and review the information. And at this point, if you'll permit me, I would withdraw my objection to 350 exhibit 26. I think as it has been produced up there, I no longer object to. And so I apologize for that confusion on my part when Ms. Trinnell moved that exhibit, but I just wanted to make sure that I could fix that. And wanted to let you know that I would withdraw my objection to that exhibit if it were going to be removed.
I'm not sure it needs to be removed. I had held the ruling in abeyance, so the motion is pending. Is there an objection to amended exhibit 26? Is there an objection to amended 26?
No, we won't object at this time.
Commissioner Fielder has asked for clarification. Good clarification question. Can we get confirmation from Ms. Trinnell that she's going to do what she averred she was going to do with the original exhibit 26, which was to clean it up and submit it for the parties? Vice President Fielder? Okay, I am going to admit amended exhibit 26, and we are going to move forward. Okay.
So we would ask Ms. Fang be temporarily excused.
Ms. Fang, you are temporarily excused. Thank you. Okay, so for the time is now 4:11 p.m. So for the settling parties, as we're calling you, how many supporting witnesses remain this time?
For the settlement itself,
Correct.
I believe that was the last witness. I would expect that our first witness in our case in chief is our chief executive officer, and there may be questions related to the settlement for him, but we did not identify him in our pre-hearing memo as such.
Okay, hold on, please. So Northwestern, you do not have any more witnesses to support the settlement.
That is correct.
MCC?
Mr. Chairman, I think we all understand that all of our witnesses are able to support the settlement, but no further witnesses called out specifically for that purpose.
All right, that's what we're trying to work through here. Okay, LCG? Captain Duffy?
No further settlement witnesses for FBA.
Okay. All right, so Northwestern?
Northwestern would like to begin its case in chief, I suppose, and we will call Brian Bird to the stand.
All right, Mr. Bird, come forward. So before you said, so let me just indicate to the parties what I intend for the rest of today. We'll go as close as we're going to cut off at 5. So wherever we are at 5 o'clock, we will break for the day. I would just remind all the parties, of course, that we will start again at 8:30 tomorrow. We will have the 9 o'clock public comment, and then we'll move on regular order there. Right, Mr. Bird, were you in the room when we did this mass swearing in?
I was, Mr. President, on Tuesday.
All right, counsel, your witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Bird, could you please state your name and spell your last for the record?
Yeah, my name is Brian B. Bird. That's Brian, Brian B, and then BIRD.
Great. And by whom are you employed?
By Northwestern Energy.
And what is your title?
My title is President and Chief Executive Officer.
In front of you, I believe you have your direct testimony. Is that correct?
I do.
And is that testimony marked as Northwestern 1?
It is.
And as you sit here today, would you answer the questions in your testimony in the same fashion?
I would.
Do you have any corrections to your testimony?
I do have a single correction. My title in the pre-filed direct testimony was President and Chief Operating Officer. My title is now President and Chief Executive Officer.
Thank you. At this time, Northwestern would move Northwestern 1.
All right, any objection to Northwestern Energy 1? Seeing none, Northwestern Energy 1 is admitted.
At this time, Northwestern would tender Mr. Bird for cross-examination.
Okay, so Ms. Hunt, just for clarification, as I understood that there was agreement among the quote settling parties not to cross-examine each other's witnesses. Does that still hold true for the cases in chief?
With one very limited exception. In paragraph 21, we did reserve one issue of natural gas production as a not settled issue. And that is the only issue, it is my understanding, that the non-settling parties would cross-examine each other's witnesses about.
Okay, with that understanding then, MCC?
I agree with that.
No, this would be the.
Thank you. Sorry.
So no questions.
Correct.
Mr. Nelson. Captain Duffy. All right, Mr. Nell.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Mr. Bird. How are
Good
you?
afternoon.
Who are the top 5 investors in Northwestern Energy?
I can't necessarily name them exactly, but we are heavily owned by index funds. BlackRock is our largest shareholder. And I'm sure since I haven't been the CFO for a couple of years, Ms. Lale could tell you the other 4.
Thank you. And Mr. Bird, to whom does Northwestern owe a fiduciary duty?
We owe a fiduciary duty to our shareholders, but we also have a duty of care and an obligation to serve our customers. So I would argue that we have a fiduciary duty to our customers as well.
And that's a legal duty imposed by Montana statute, which the commission is charged with ensuring that you meet it. Is that right?
That obligation to serve, correct.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
HRC. Noble Northwest. MEIC. All right. It was a joint, no question there. Time for commissioner questioning, Vice President Fielder,
None at this time, Mr. President. Thank you.
Commissioner Pedochi,
No questions, Mr. President.
Commissioner Bukacek. I don't know if you heard that. She said no questions. I don't have any questions for this witness, Mr. Hamilton.
No questions.
Could I ask one redirect question?
Of course.
Mr. Byrd, you just talked about having a duty of care and an obligation to serve customers. Can you just speak briefly about how the settlement fulfills those obligations?
From our perspective, we're trying to balance reliability, affordability, and sustainability. And from how I looked at the settlement and the impact on customers, yes, we had a large increase. That increase, by the way, I really attribute to two factors. We heard a lot about the $1 billion investment since 2015 and 2017 for electric and gas. And by the way, that $1 billion and the recovery of the cost and return on that investment was 49% of the ask that we had as in this hearing. We also had 42% of that request was recovery of pass-through costs that we expended, we had no return on, that we have to pay, and ultimately we need the recovery of those costs. I think property taxes and supply costs. And so from my perspective, there was a significant compromise from the company, as shown in this exhibit, approximately 25% on the electric side and approximately 30% on the gas side. And so I agree with the settling parties. I guess it was Ms. Fang who said mutual happiness, mutual unhappiness, and ultimately been put in the role in the past to negotiate with the parties. I understood as the three people who primarily responsible for the settlement, I thought did a nice job to represent us. I expressed concerns about certain things that we gave away, I would argue. But at the end of the day, we felt that the compromise was fair, not only for our shareholders, but also for our customers.
Thank you. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Are you seeking to temporarily or permanently excuse this witness?
Permanently excused.
Any objection to permanently excusing this witness? Seeing none, Mr. Byrd, thank you for coming today. Thank you for testifying.
Thank you, Mr. President and Commissioners.
Safe travels. All right. Ms. Norcott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, President. We would call our next witness. That would be Michael Cashel.
All right, Mr. Cashel. Greetings, Mr. Cashel. Okay. All right, Mr. Cashel, raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right, counsel, your witness.
Thank you. Mr. Cashel, would you please state your name, spelling your last name and your business address for the record?
Yes, it's Michael Cashel. Last name is spelled Cashell. Business address is 11 East Park, Butte, Montana.
And by whom are you employed?
Northwestern Energy.
Would you please provide the commission with your title at Northwestern Energy?
Yes, Vice President of Transmission.
Mr. Cashel, did you submit pre-filed direct testimony in this docket?
I did.
And placed before you is a document that has been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit NWE 2. You take a moment and review that and indicate when you've finished.
I'm done.
Is NWE 2 a true and correct copy of your pre-filed direct testimony?
Yes.
And if I were to ask you here today under oath the same questions that set forth in Exhibit NWE 2, would your answers be the same except for any changes or modifications?
It would be the same.
Do you have any corrections or modifications to make to Exhibit NWE 2?
No, I do not.
Mr. Chairman, I move for the admission of Exhibit NWE 2.
Are there any objections to the admission of NWE 2? Seeing none, NWE 2 is admitted. Please
Miss-
proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Cashel, did you submit pre-filed rebuttal testimony in this docket?
Yes, I did.
And placed before you is also a document that has been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit NWE 3. Have you reviewed that?
Yes, I have.
Is NWE 3 a true and correct copy of your pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
Yes, it is.
And if I were to ask you here today under oath the same questions that are set forth in that exhibit, would your answers be the same except for any corrections or modifications?
Yes, they would.
And do you have any corrections or modifications that you need to make to Exhibit NWE 3?
Just one on page 19, line 1. Delete the word firm.
With that, Mr. Chairman, I move for the admission of Exhibit NWE 3 as amended.
Any objection to the admission of NWE 3 as amended? Seeing none, NWE 3 as amended is admitted.
Thank you. With that, Mr. President, Mr. Cashel is available for cross-examination and questioning from the commission.
Mr. Brown,
No questions. Thank you.
Mr. Nelson, Captain Duffy, Ms. Tranel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon. Mike, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Is it a fair characterization to say that transmission costs are a pretty good chunk of the increase that we're looking at here in this case?
They are certainly a portion of the revenue requirement. Yes.
Can you just give us a simple summary of why that is? It looks to me as if they took a big leap, I think was what the somebody else had said. And I'm just wondering, can you tell us what happened?
Sure. I would characterize this as not a big leap, but keeping up with our investment criteria and making sure we can provide reliable service to our customers. My direct testimony describes the 4 elements that we use to make investment on the system. One is capacity. The next is asset life, reliability, and then compliance. So we are constantly looking at the capacity needs of our customers, which requires us to increase capacity deliverability on our system. Asset life, which is the ability for the assets that are in service to continue in service to be maintained or be replaced.
Mike, I'm sorry, can I just interrupt you and ask, when you say asset life, you're talking about transmission asset, correct?
Yes, transmission. Okay. This also applies to our distribution assets and to generation assets as well, but asset life, all assets have a specific life. So the next category would be reliability, and that is that as our system changes and demands on it change, the reliability needs may change, and the need to provide a dual source, for example, into a large community, a transmission source into a large community or anywhere, to meet the reliability needs of our customers is another category. And then finally, compliance. Our compliance needs are changing consistently and rapidly. For example, critical infrastructure protection, that's a NERC criteria that we have to provide for cybersecurity of our physical assets on our transmission system. That's just one category, but those are the 4 basic elements of what causes us to make investment on our system. And they're very similar on the gas side, by the way. We make investments on the gas side for the very same reasons.
Thank you. Did Northwestern recently sell a distribution line into Missoula to Missoula Electric Co-op?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay. Is it does transmission have value to Northwestern? Are you able to sell transmission to third parties?
Yes, actually, we are. In fact, we're not only able, but we're required to sell transmission capacity to third parties. We're regulated by FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, on our transmission system. And as a result, we have to provide open access to customers. What that means is that we have a tariff that states the rates and conditions that we sell that service that's set at FERC. So we have periodic rate filings with FERC to set those rates and conditions. And we generate revenue from our FERC customers, which include large customers like choice customers that are not taking their supply from Northwestern Energy. It also includes customers that transport energy across our system. We refer to those as point-to-point customers. All of that revenue is taken together, and as our testimony, my testimony, and Glenda Gibson's testimony also in this case indicate, that revenue is used to offset the rates for the rest of our customers on the transmission system.
Thank you. It's my understanding that Northwestern had an opportunity to either participate in or purchase or be a part of the proposed DC line from Colstrip to Minneapolis and chose not to participate in that line. Is that accurate? And if so, why did Northwestern make that decision?
So that's not accurate. For the purposes of the commission, the line that I think Ms. Tranel is talking about is a recently announced potential transmission line called Grid United. Is that the correct line? And it's again, a potential future line that would, as the proponents suggest, run from the MISO and SPP area east of our system in the Dakotas and interconnect to the Colstrip facility. We've had discussions with Grid United because obviously it's going to connect with our system. We need to, number one, know about it. So if it does happen, we need to be able to effectively plan for it. And it does represent something that we need to stay abreast of. That would be a very major development within Montana. And by no means did we try to block that.
Okay, and I wasn't implying that you had tried to block it. I was just asking about whether or not it was something that you would be interested in participating in and pursuing as a revenue opportunity for Northwestern and Montana.
So that decision hasn't been made yet, obviously. It's something we need to keep our eyes on as we do in any kind of major regional development.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. No further questions, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ms. Tranel. HRC?
No questions.
Okay.
Noble Northwest.
Thank you, Mr. President. We do have a couple questions. Hi, Mr. Cashel. My name is, sorry, I can barely see you. My name is Barbara Chilcott. I'm one of the attorneys representing Renewable Northwest.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'd like to direct your attention to your rebuttal testimony that has been admitted as Northwest Energy number 3.
Yes, I have it.
Okay, great. Let's see here. Just a couple questions on this. Starting, let's see, on page, what's numbered in the exhibit MRC-10, starting around page line 12.
I'm there.
Okay, I need to get there myself. So in that section of your rebuttal testimony, you discuss testimony of Dr. Sashwat Roy, who provided pre-filed testimony for Renewable Northwest in this case. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in this section, starting on line 9 of page MRC-10, you are asked to comment on figure 13 in Dr. Roy's testimony, which shows the firm and non-firm available transmission capacity in 2024. Is that right?
That's my recollection, yes.
Okay. And so this line of questioning and your rebuttal testimony is really geared toward determining basically reliable import capacity. Is that true?
I'm sorry, can you say it one more time?
Sure. This portion of your rebuttal testimony was geared toward Dr. Roy's chart, which discussed reliable import capacity. Is that correct?
Yes, Dr. Roy was suggesting that we could serve a very large portion of our load reliably with imports, and I was rebutting that.
Okay. Thank you. And so my question is, has Northwestern Energy done an analysis to evaluate available transfer capability on all of the major transmission paths that connect it to the broader West based on historical data?
We have, as my testimony presented, we analyze frequently the import capacity available to us, and we operate every day. We understand the operation of the system. So I feel like that we are very well positioned to understand what's available in the market, what's available on the transmission systems interconnecting to us. Have we done a study? I would not say I've done a study, but I don't think I need to, given our understanding of the system.
Thanks. And you did anticipate my next question. So given that Northwestern hasn't done a study, what I guess on what information do you then base your understanding of the import or the transfer capability then?
It's the actual information that we experience every day, every hour. We post our transmission capacity available on our OASIS system, open access transmission system. We're required to under our FERC open access tariff. So we have lots and lots of data. Much of it was examined during data requests, and we provided information. There was a request from some of the interveners on transmission capability. And it shows, especially during very high loading periods during our system, that available import capacity, especially on a firm basis, which is very significant when you consider resources to serve our load, should be firm. Our data shows that on peak days and peak hours specifically, there's just not adequate import capacity to rely on the market to serve our system.
Okay, thank you. And next, I'd like to direct your attention, please, Mr. Cashel, to page MRC 17 of your rebuttal testimony.
Okay.
And on that page of your rebuttal testimony, you discuss pre-filed testimony from experts for both MEIC and Renewable Northwest about basically the prudency of relying on imports, like we were just discussing. And you reflected that neither of those testimonies from Dr. Roy or Goggin recognize that there can be transmission system disruptions. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I think you're referring to question starting on line 8, MRC 17. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And my question then is, has Northwestern Energy studied the impacts of generation disruptions due to fuel unavailability, weather-related events, to their thermal resource capacity contributions?
Can you state that one more time, please?
Sure. I guess my question then is, has Northwestern Energy studied the impacts of generation disruptions that occur based on these types of events, whether it's weather-related disruptions, fuel unavailability? Has Northwestern studied the impact of those events to their thermal resource capacity contributions?
So once again, I would say that actual experience is very valuable in this area. I've been with Northwestern and been in this business for nearly 37 years. Almost all of it's been in the bulk electric system portion of the operation. And I can say that while there are disruptions with almost any generation source, the thermal resources that you mentioned have a high availability factor. They're normally, if there is a fuel source there, they are usually available. So again, I don't think I need a study to tell me that our thermal resources have contributed significantly to our reliability.
Thank you. My last question, Mr. Cashel, if you could please turn to MRC, page MRC 24.
Okay.
In just a second, I'll get you a line number. So really the question that takes up the whole page starting on line 1. And you discussed the kind of the concept that Dr. Roy just advanced about increasing transmission capacity as a solution. Increasing capacity on the northern grid would give Northwestern Energy the ability to import more power into Montana. And on that page, you kind of addressed that point made by Dr. Roy, correct?
Yes.
My question regarding that is, has Northwestern Energy evaluated working with Bonneville Power Administration to upgrade Path 8 to allow for greater imports and compared those potential upgrade costs to the cost of building new resources like the Yellowstone gas plant?
So the answer to your first question is yes. We have actually worked with Bonneville Power Administration and the other coal strip owners on a number of different occasions to see what the possibilities could be to upgrade the transmission capacity on the coal strip transmission system and what's called the Montana intertie. Montana intertie is the extension of the coal strip transmission system that runs from roughly the Townsend area to Garrison. And we actually collaborated on this, and also it was re-collaborated, if you will, during the effort. I can't remember exactly what the name of this effort was, but it was an effort to determine if renewables could be built out in Montana and the coal strip system could be utilized to help export them. And the answer was yes, there's probably an opportunity to do that, upgrade the transmission system, but it would take coordinated efforts among lots of parties and also transmission service requests from potential transmission users to utilize the transmission and also pay for it. Our open access transmission tariff process operates under the notion, if you will, that if someone asks for transmission capacity and upgrade, that there's mechanisms under our tariff to actually pay for that. And we've actually, over the years, we've actually run open seasons, actually trying to attract customers to pay for transmission capacity so that we could upgrade our transmission system from Montana to the west. Those have not been successful, mainly because, well, I'll just put it this way. They have not been successful. We've not had parties willing to pay the costs associated with those upgrades. Can you say your second question one more time?
Yeah, sure. The second question really is, whether you've compared those costs of those potential upgrades to the cost of building new resources.
So I have not made that comparison personally, but what I can say is that the costs associated with upgrading the 500 kV system plus the Bonneville section of the Montana intertie, and this is kind of off of memory, but these are back in 2006 dollars, probably $200 to $300 million alone on the Montana section of it, the coal strip transmission section, and probably double that on Bonneville section. And that would result in some additional capacity. But the point is that the upgrade costs for transmission, even for upgrading existing transmission, are very, very significant. And then one other thing I'd say is that Northwestern Energy also attempted to build a 500 kV transmission line from southwestern Montana down into south central Idaho. And we attempted to permit that, never did get to construction, but we attempted to permit that in the period of 2008, 2012. The estimated cost for that line, which would have been about 300 miles, was over $1 billion in those dollar days, 2006 timeframe. And we, as my testimony indicated, we had a very difficult time with the potential permitting for that. So I would say two things in response to your second question. Number one, transmission development is very costly. Number two, it takes an extreme amount of time. And as far as a comparison to building out resources within our footprint, it's a very hard comparison to make because of those unknowns. And then as my testimony also indicates, generation within Montana actually supports the transmission system in Montana from an ancillary standpoint, voltage support, all those sorts of things. And the conclusion of my rebuttal testimony is that if we didn't have a transmission system that we built decades ago today, we'd be in much, much worse condition than we are right now. So thankfully we did that as well as the rest of the region. But the rest of the region and Montana now face a transmission and a generation resource change that I'm concerned about every time we roll into winter or summer, whether or not we can serve our customers reliably.
Thank you, Mr. Cashel. Actually, one more question. Sorry. I'm just curious, and I think I probably know the answer to this, but so has Northwestern Energy considered any new upgrades then to lines through the northern grid?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Has Northwestern Energy considered any new upgrades or lines through northern grid?
So we have not submitted a request for any kind of a study, but the attempts that I just described were significant regional transmission attempts.
In the last 10 years, have there been any other attempts?
There haven't, and there's a pretty good reason for that. At least one good reason. We spent over $24 million attempting to build that transmission line. At the end of the day, we could not get permitting for it, and we wrote that off. That's a significant impact, and our shareholders absorbed all of that, and that was in 2012. That's one reason. Another reason is that it's just very, very difficult to do. The northern grid process that you're talking about is a planning process, but it's not a building process. And submitting a request for study to northern grid doesn't necessarily translate into building transmission.
Okay, thanks. And I think, that's kind of what I'm getting at is that, I guess don't you see value though in kind of a long-term planning process, which would include, planning for upgrades such as the ones I'm suggesting today?
I'm sorry. If I left you with the impression that we don't see value in long-term planning, that was certainly not the intention. We do have a long-term planning process, not only within our own footprint, we're required to have that, and it just makes good sense. But we do participate in all the regional activity. We follow the northern grid process closely, and at some point in time, it might be a tool that is usable by us, but it's not something that we've been able to use to date to actually build new transmission.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Chilcott. May I see how long do you expect your questioning to go? Oh, wonderful. Okay. What I think we'll do, this would obviously be the time for commissioner questioning. What I think we'll do is probably just break here, but I do have a question that maybe may cut down on the time required for this hearing. Northwestern Energy, you have identified a number of witnesses that you intend to move for the entry of their pre-file testimony, correct?
Mr. President, yes, we have a significant number of witnesses in this case.
Correct. So as the parties know, this is just an idea. As the parties know, prior to this hearing, the commission requested that each of the parties identify who they may be interested in examining and the amount of time they estimated with each witness. I have, by my count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 11 of the Northwestern Energy witnesses did not have any party indicate that they would like to question them. And so I would like I'm not going to ask for this now, but I'd like each of the parties to consider whether they would stipulate to the admission of the pre-file testimony of the parties, and I'll name them. Pohl, P-O-H-L?
Pohl.
Vold, Bailey, Cleverly, Clafferty, Meager or Marr, depending on the.
Maker.
That one's a tough one.
Trust me, I had to ask him as well.
Doesn't seem like it. McGowan. Getting old. Yorkman, Kinsey, White, and Normand. So if the parties could confer, maybe we can just stipulate to the entry of those pre-filed testimonies at some point. Strike Vold from that. We have a commissioner that apparently would like to ask Mr. Vold questions. So if the parties would take some time to confer with each other to see if we can just stipulate to the movement of those pre-filed testimonies in the record, I'd appreciate it.
Will do.
Okay, thank you. All right, the time is now 4:49 p.m. We had a good work day today, so thank you again to the parties for that, for conducting this hearing in a good workmanlike manner. As indicated, we will begin tomorrow again at 8:30 a.m. What you have?
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. President, maybe you're getting there, but we'll come back to Mr. Cashel tomorrow.
Of course.
Okay.
Public comment at 9. Okay, so the time is now 4:50 p.m. and we will go off the record and resume tomorrow.